Hello, I'm Rochelle Ferguson-Biahi, filling in for Annette Young. Welcome to the 51%, a show about women who are reshaping our world. Coming up in today's programme. Afghan women react with scepticism as the Taliban reveals its views on women and their place in society has changed. Also coming up, 2 years after mass protest in Poland against government plans to ban abortion, Human Rights Watch researcher Hillary Margolis tells us about attacks on women's rights in the country. Plus, we bring you a France 24 report from Ouagadougou on a woman who goes by the name of Mama Africa. As the only female trucker in West Africa, she's been defying gender norms for decades and wants to teach younger women what she knows. But first, marking a new chapter in the abuse crisis rocking the Catholic Church, Pope Francis has admitted that priests and bishops have sexually abused nuns and said in one case that they were kept as sex slaves. Well, it's the first time the Pope and the Church as an institution has publicly acknowledged abuse is taking place. Speaking as he wrapped up the first papal visit to the Arabian Peninsula, the Argentine pontiff criticised the poor treatment of women.
The mistreatment of women is a problem. I would dare to say that humanity has not yet matured. Women are treated like second-class citizens, and it starts from there, no? It is a cultural problem.
Next, during recent peace talks with senior Afghan politicians, the Taliban offered a rare insight into how they see women today. During their time in power, the hardline group excluded women from public life. They now say they do support women's rights, particularly when it comes to education and work. Well, that claim has been outright rejected by some women in Afghanistan, concerned about losing hard-won freedoms.
Mina owns and manages a cafe in Kabul. When the Taliban were in power, their strict interpretation of Sharia law forced women out of public life and behind closed doors. Now that the insurgents could be about to hold peace talks with the government, Mina is afraid.
I think freedom for women post-Taliban has been a huge achievement. And if we now go backwards, well, it would be a huge step in the wrong direction. It would be an extremely heavy price for us to pay.
18 years ago, the US invasion of Afghanistan led to the toppling of the Taliban. Over the years, the insurgents regrouped and now control vast swathes of the country. Nonetheless, under President Donald Trump, the US insists it's time to pull out all American troops. Women's fortunes have improved considerably under Afghanistan's post-Taliban constitution. Over 30% of school children are now girls, and a quarter of seats in parliament are reserved for women. Journalist Najwa Alemi is terrified that these gains could be lost if a post-conflict government includes the Taliban.
I won't accept a peace deal that asks me to go back and sit at home. I will raise my voice. I'll never be ready to accept a deal that costs me my freedom, restricts me, makes me wear a burqa and puts me in a cage. I won't accept a peace deal that brings stability but puts me in jail.
Others, however, are less wary, believing the Taliban understands that the world has changed since it last came to power in the mid-1990s.
This time round, the Taliban won't be the Taliban of previous years. I am sure their beliefs have changed. Also, there is a big difference between the way people are now and the way people were during the Taliban's rule. These days, people are educated. They don't ever want to return to the past.
The Afghan president has made it clear that direct talks with the Taliban are an important next step. For the country's women, however, hard-won freedoms are not a price they're willing to pay for peace.
Next, a damning report released by Human Rights Watch underlines ongoing attacks on women's rights in Poland. The 75-page report, entitled "The Breath of the Government on My Back," details not only raids carried out on women's rights groups, but also smear campaigns launched against them by the ruling Law and Justice Party. Well, the report comes more than 2 years after Poland's first mass protests against government efforts to enact a complete abortion ban. Well, to tell us more, Hillary Margolis is a women's rights researcher at Human Rights Watch. She joins us from London. Thanks very much for speaking to the 51% today. Hillary, you are the author of the report. It shines the light on what it says are the Polish government's consistent efforts to obstruct women's rights and their organisations. How did you gather that information?
Well, we traveled across Poland, in fact, speaking with women's rights activists and organizations, as well as sort of everyday women who had been affected by these efforts, these government efforts to really undermine women's rights, including women, for example, who were brought before disciplinary proceedings because they simply had indicated support for women's protests or had collaborated with women's rights groups.
The report also, Hillary, flags up a climate of fear that's being instilled, not necessarily amongst those who are part of a women's rights group, but those who support their ideas in some way.
Exactly. As I mentioned earlier, we spoke with several women. We documented cases of those who had, for example, simply worn black to support the mass black protest movement of women's rights to their jobs as school teachers and were then dragged before disciplinary proceedings. Other teachers and headmasters as well. One school teacher we talked with had helped to support black protests in her town and to organize activities and felt that she had to be completely anonymous in doing so because as a school teacher, she faced enormous repercussions if anyone found out that she was even remotely involved with these protests.
You explore also the way that women's rights organisations are often vilified or misrepresented as though they are some way contrary to the traditional values of Polish society.
Exactly. There's been a real taking on of this idea against so-called gender ideology or anything having to do with gender equality and gender or women's rights in Poland, both by the government and the church. And what they've done is they've used this rhetoric to claim that women's rights groups, as well as LGBT rights activists, or anyone really who doesn't fit the so-called traditional norm, is dangerous to society and dangerous to families and to children. And they're claiming, for example, that women's rights groups are actually sort of a guise for promoting homosexuality, promoting transgenderism, so-called sexualization of children, and so on. All of these things that people find very threatening and menacing. And they're saying that this goes against Poland's traditional values and family. And therefore, they're really smearing these kinds of groups and these activists publicly.
Now, your report also stresses that there is a real lack of funding when it comes to quite essential women-centred organisations. That's a huge problem that the report says needs to be addressed.
Absolutely. Another way that the government has really been undermining women's rights is through systematic defunding of these kinds of organizations. And it's important to note that these women's rights groups are often the ones filling the gap for meeting the needs of women survivors of violence who need services, for example, or also conducting sexual and reproductive health education. So without these groups, we're facing an enormous lack of these kinds of services in Poland. And what we're seeing is that the government is defunding them, and that's really crippling a lot of these groups because they have very little access to other sources of funding. It's very difficult for such small and medium-sized groups to directly access, for example, EU funding. And so they tend to be very reliant on local and national government funding, and when that has diminished, by significant amounts, they've had to do things like cut their number of services, cut their number of staff. We talked to groups, for example, who used to serve around 3,000 women a year and are now only able to serve around 1,000. Or groups who used to cover half of a province to provide services like shelter and psychosocial support and legal aid for survivors of violence, and they can now only work in 2 points instead of 13 different service points. So we're seeing a real impact on everyday women and girls who are facing risks and not having anywhere to go.
Okay, Hillary Margolis, you're a women's rights researcher from Human Rights Watch. Thanks for those insights today on the 51%. We head now to Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso, where one woman has defied gender norms for 3 decades now. As the only female trucker in West Africa, Mamacita Cisse has transported thousands of tons of goods across the region at the wheel of a truck. France 24's Khalidou Si and Bangali Touri went to meet her.
The national road that links Lomé to Ouagadougou stretches on for 950 kilometers, but it's not the first time Maman Africa has made the journey between the two capitals. Massata Cissé is 57 years old and has spent more than half her life on the road behind the wheel of her truck. She's West Africa's only female trucker.
Thieves once attacked me near Sandiata. They even shot at the truck and wanted to take my money. I was very scared that day. It was my grandson that saved me. May he rest in peace.
Massata works for a cement factory and hits the road 2 to 3 times a month. In an industry dominated by men, she's managed to carve a place for herself. Her boss is now keener than ever to recruit more women to take on trucker jobs.
From the experiences that we've had with male drivers, we're thinking that if we had more women, maybe there would be more discipline, because women have the reputation of being more disciplined.
After a week away, Maman Africa's reunited with her family. Her sister and daughter try not to worry when she's out on the road.
People once came to tell us that our sister was killed on the road. People can be very mean, and her colleagues especially don't treat her well at all. I would like someone to help her because she's getting older. We're a family of drivers. Our father was a trucker.
A family tradition Massata wants to see live on.
I'm waiting for some help to buy 1 or 2 trucks and to teach boys and girls, because I'd like to open a training school. I also want girls to have the same courage I had.
A call to women across West Africa to join Maman Africa out on the open road.
Well, that's it for now. You can also connect with us via our Facebook page. That's France24.51%. Or why not send us a tweet at _51%. So until our next show, it's bye for now.